are blind to the worlds within us, waiting to be born.
Hey guys, you're listening to Metal Matters, a weekly Gimme Radio podcast. I'm your host, Mike Hill. If you like metal, punk, hardcore, or anything extreme, you've come to the right place. So subscribe and never miss out. Thanks for tuning in. My good friend, music journalist Jay Bennett is back for another episode of Classic Records. This time around, we're covering At the Gates' Slaughter of the Soul, a record that most will agree is iconic and has changed the course of death metal, inspiring a whole legion of bands. If you dig the show, please share, leave an iTunes review, and tell all your friends about it. If you want to hit me up with questions, suggestions, or just to say hi, the best way is to DM me on Instagram. My Instagram handle is Michael_DC_Hill. Slaughter of the Soul, the fourth studio album by At the Gates, Swedish death metal band. Probably one of the most influential bands of the 90s, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. No question about it.
Yeah, so the record was released October 3rd, 1995 on Earache Records, recorded May through July 1995, produced by Fredrik Nordstrom, recorded and mixed at Studio Fredman, Gothenburg, Sweden. Program length, 34 minutes and 8 seconds. Tomas Lindberg on vocals, Anders Jorler on guitar. He plays phaser drums on the song Into the Dead Sky. Martin Larsson, guitar. Jonas Jorler on bass. Adrian Erlandson on drums. And of course, we have Andy LaRock from King Diamond. Appears, he rips a solo on Cold.
Yeah.
So what's really cool about this episode specifically, Jay, is that you put together this wonderful piece for Decibel Magazine's Hall of Fame for this album. So I'm assuming you have like all these insights into the recording, the creation of this album that a lot of us don't have.
Yeah, that's true. And I had to that article came out quite some time ago. I don't know if your listeners are familiar with Decibel's Hall of Fame series, but it's been going on for quite some time. And this At the Gates article was actually the second one, the second Hall of Fame article. It came out in March of 2005. I had to refer back to the internet to find that.
Wow.
The first album in the Hall of Fame, was Rain and Blood by Slayer.
Oh,
so this was the second one we did, and I had to go back and review because it's been some time, 14 years or something. But going back over the article, and I remember speaking to those guys about this record, and I was very excited because I don't think I had spoken to any of them before. And I loved this record then. I love it now. But what was interesting at the time, among many things, but Martin Larsson, one of the guitar players, he had, by the time I spoke with him in, probably early 2005 or late 2004, depending on when the interview took place, he had kind of stopped playing music. At the Gates was not a band at the time that I did these interviews. They broke up 10 months or so, something like that, after this record, after Slaughter of the Soul came out. And they got back together in 2007. But at the time I did the interviews, they were not a band. And Martin Larsson had not only not played music in quite some time, he hadn't spoken English in so long. He was nervous about. I remember corresponding with him on email, and he was like, "I haven't spoken English in 8 years,
Wow.
So I don't know how this is going to go."
Oh, man.
Yeah, I thought that was pretty funny.
What's actually kind of interesting is a lot of people back in the 90s were saying that Slaughter of the Soul was the Rain and Blood of the 90s. So I think it's really there's some synchronicity here with Decibel going for Rain and Blood with their first Hall of Fame record, and this being the second one.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think what was especially interesting about Slaughter of the Soul is that it seems like, there was kind of this wave of melodic death metal bands coming out of Sweden, with your a Dissection I know is kind of like on that black metal, death metal kind of line, but they were definitely more melodic than all the other black metal bands. So you had Dissection,
yeah.
You had At the Gates, you had, Dark Tranquility, In Flames, all these kind of bands that were injecting melody into this. And how I saw that play out, at least in the States, and I think, I'm sure you saw this too, most of the bands that seemed to pick up on that at first were hardcore bands.
Oh yeah, definitely, for sure. I mean, there was Darkest Hour.
Yeah,
that band comes to mind immediately. Year of Our Lord, which was a probably lesser known metallic hardcore band from New England.
Yep.
And then later, Black Dahlia Murder.
Black Dahlia Murder, yeah. And then you had the bands, and then you have the bands that everyone knows, like the Black Dahlia Murders, and then especially in Massachusetts where we came up, you had Shadows Fall and Killswitch Engage and all these kinds of bands that were sort of riding that line between metal and hardcore, and but definitely like melodic death metal. Like that was the thing, and At the Gates was definitely at the forefront of all that. Like I didn't see, not to diss those other bands, but I didn't see any of those bands saying like shouting out In Flames or Dark Tranquility in their interviews or something. It was always At the Gates, Slaughter of the Soul.
Yeah, well, I mean, that record, I remember hearing it in the 90s, around, 95, 96, that time frame. And I was like, I'd never actually, it was a death metal record. But prior to that, the death metal that I knew was like, Carcass, Morbid Angel. I think Nile's that first Nile record was out. Very brutal, amelodic kind of stuff. And then when I heard Slaughter of the Soul, it was like an Iron Maiden kind of thing. It was like if Iron Maiden was a death metal band, it would sound like this particular record,
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think, Carcass is an interesting one to mention because I think they did a similar thing in that, Carcass started out as like a sort of like really primitive sort of like grindcore band that was kind of like their early records, especially their first record, was kind of like almost like indecipherable, like what was happening.
Yeah.
And then by the time you got to like Heartwork, they were a melodic death metal band, and I think that record came out, I don't know, this around the same time. Was it a year or two before or after Slaughter of the Soul? It was they were right around in that same time period, Yeah,
it was in the same, sort of era. Definitely. Yeah. They were done with the brutality of the rawness of those early records.
There was like an interesting thing happening in sort of like extreme metal, for a lack of a better term at that time, with sort of the injection of the melody into black metal and death metal. And I think At the Gates, like clearly at the forefront of that,
Well, also let's remember too that 1995, like metal was kind of at an all-time low too.
Yeah, totally.
I mean, it wasn't really not nearly as popular as it is now, and a lot of these tours were they would have to package like 4 or 5 bands just to get like 150 people to come out.
Yeah.
So I mean, this record coming out at the time and it having like a very old, that whole Swedish melodic sound to me, almost has like a new wave of British heavy metal, like sort of twist to it. You know what I mean? Like very, solos and guitar harmonies and, the melody.
Yeah. So, absolutely, man. Absolutely.
Yeah. So for them to like reach further, like back into like almost like a hard rock sort of vibration at that particular time, and to be as successful as it was, I thought was like, pretty unlikely yet amazing.
Yeah. No, I agree, man. They were sort of ahead of their time, but but simultaneously they were really kind of refining what they had kind of done all along, really. They kind of always did this style. It just wasn't as good until they hit this point, really. You know what I mean? Like, unlike Carcass, who kind of like, the example I used before, kind of changed their style like almost completely. At the Gates didn't really do that. They just kind of improved upon what they were already doing, you know?
Yeah. Some of the other earlier records, there's definitely the melody was where you can see the progression of the band,
Yeah.
As they got better at playing and better at songwriting.
Yeah.
The other thing I really dug about the band too is that Tomas Lindberg was, he kind of walked that line between being like a crust punk and a metal guy. You know what I mean?
Yeah, totally, man. He had like the dreadlocks, and I think even, I went back and reread my Hall of Fame piece, and he kind of was talking about how, at least I think it was that, or I read some other article, but he was kind of talking about how he was always kind of like sort of 50% metal and 50% hardcore. He kind of was always that way. And, obviously he's played in many hardcore bands in Sweden as well. So he's kind of always, he listens to both types of music, like country and Western,
Both types of music.
Yeah.
And also the record sounded better than most of its contemporary releases at the time too. Sonically, that record was like, I remember hearing it in the van for the very first time, and I'd never actually heard that sort of quality on like an earache release. Like I thought it was like the best sounding record probably to this day that label had put out,
Yeah, and I would have to go back and look at Fredrik Nordstrom's history, but I feel like, he was definitely he definitely had done other records at that time, but I think that was kind of one of the records that, it wasn't long after that, like 3 or 4 years after that. He was like the guy for this stuff. You know what I mean? Like it was definitely one of the records that kind of made his name,
What's funny about this record being a classic record here on Metal Matters is that it actually is a record that most people will agree is a classic record. I was just thinking about that,
Yeah, it's pretty undeniable. And that kind of goes back to what we were saying earlier. It's like, it's not just metal people that are into this record. It's like, you'll get people like not only hardcore guys, but there's kind of people who don't even like really listen to metal who'll be like, oh yeah, Slaughter the Soul. Like, you know what I mean? It's got that like that crossover into almost, not quite mainstream, but something approaching that. Like, you know what I mean? It's known beyond, the metal world in some ways.
Yeah, it's definitely, I would venture to say, probably one of the most influential records in extreme music because of that,
Yeah.
Like we mentioned earlier, these other bands that were inspired by it. So now the curious thing though, and maybe you can shed some light on this, is this record came out. It's probably to date at the time this record came out, the band's finest moment as far as like producing a record that was powerful and impactful.
Yeah.
And then 10 months later, the band disappears for 11 years. So, any idea why the band broke up, or is it just like time to break up?
Yeah. So from what I understand, Anders, one of the twins, the guitar player, was just kind of couldn't take the pressure. Apparently, they were just the album did really well. They toured, they toured Europe, they toured the States. They were kind of all set up to do another one. Earache was kind of like chomping at the bit, wanting another record, and he kind of just didn't want to deal with, they were getting tour offers after tour offers, like these tours that stacked up for like months on end. I think they were on tour for like 7 months straight before they broke up, like something ridiculous like that. And he was just like, I can't take it anymore. And so he quit, and they were like, well, he writes most of the music. What are we going to do? And ironically, I think, and I have to double check this to make sure I've got the right twin, because I always get Anders and Jonas, the twin brothers, confused. So ironically, Anders quit again. So the band got back together in 2007. They did 2 more records, including one that came out like last year.
Yeah.
And Anders quit again before that record came out. And they went ahead and did another one without him anyways. But they were concerned at the time, at the time of the Slaughter of the Soul time, they felt that they couldn't do that. So they broke up. But another interesting thing that, speaking of I think the fact that they broke up so soon after this came out and it was such a good record, it kind of cemented their legendary status. And, that was kind of borne out because, Thomas Lindbergh is kind of quoted as saying, it's not often that you see, his royalty checks were more like 8 years after the record came out. Or like when it came, like, you know what I mean? Like you don't see that very often where like the record is selling more 8 years later than it did when it came out. I mean, it's pretty unusual,
I probably should have researched this before this conversation, but do you know if that record charted at all?
I don't know. I'm not sure. I mean, I highly doubt it charted in the States. Maybe in Europe somehow, but I'm not sure. I mean, it's funny. There's also some quotes from the band members from that time talking about how they got a lot of good reviews, but they also got like an alarming number of bad reviews too when this record came out. So it kind of wasn't maybe the instantaneous hit that it maybe seems to be in retrospect. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I find that odd because I do remember when it came out. And, I was living in Boston. I was working at the Newberry Comics warehouse. And along with like a cast of future luminaries, including, members of ISIS and Blood for Blood and whatever. And I remember everyone loving this record, man. I couldn't, it's like people that I was surprised like this record. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Emo kids, like we were talking before. Metal kids, yep. Hardcore kids. So yeah, I just always remember people glowing about this album. And it was undeniable to me that it was a fine record.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely, man. And it's still, I listen to it. This is one of the records I come back to regularly. Like, it's been out for 20 plus years at this point, almost 25 years. Crazy. And it is one of those records that I find myself gravitating back to. I had it on CD for years and years, and I actually just bought a vinyl copy of this like last year. I think I never had it on vinyl, and I was like, yeah, you know what? I that's one of those records. I've got to have it, and it just doesn't. It holds up, man. Too, it was great in '95, and it's great now.
How did you find this record? Was it like something that came to you as far as like you were writing at that point, I think, right?
No, I mean, I hadn't quite started writing yet. Okay, so this came out in '95. I want to say I came across this because I was before I started doing the show, there was a show on WERS in Boston called Nasty Habits, which was the metal show. And I started doing the show in '96 at some point.
Okay.
But the guy who did it before me, with Mark Thompson, who he would, they would always get the new releases in at the station. And this was one of those new releases. And he played it for me when it was new, hot off the press. And I was like, instantly blown away. And then this was something that we would play like regularly on that show. I mean, it was a staple even back then, I mean, I took over that show in '96 and I was still playing it, when it was like a year old or so, 2 years old. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's how I heard it. Yeah.
Wow. Nasty Habits, WERS.
Yeah.
I was just talking about that show. Does that show still exist by any chance?
I don't think so. No.
But wasn't there like the demise of that radio show happened because someone like literally forgot to renew with the college or something like that?
I don't know how the show ended, but there's an interesting the story about how it started is fascinating. Not to get too off track, but I'll just give the brief synopsis. Apparently, it was started by a guy who was not even a student at Emerson College. He just kind of bluffed his way into it and started the show. And that guy was later arrested and convicted of a murder charge,
Really?
Years and years later. Yeah, like long after I had even done the show, like at some point in the early 2000s or something. Yeah, which is crazy. Yeah.
Now, another quick question about Nasty Habits.
Yeah.
Were you the DJ when my old band played on Nasty Habits, or was it Thompson? Or were you there? I don't remember exactly.
When Otis played?
Yeah.
I think that would have been Thompson.
Okay.
Yeah, that would have been Thompson's era. Yeah. Yeah.
Those are good times. Yeah. Definitely.
Yeah.
Back to At the Gates.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I remember hearing this at, like I said, at the Newbury Comics Warehouse, and that was like, 96. And, working there, actually, as much of a sort of dreary kind of job as that was, working in a warehouse, it definitely was a way that I was able to find out about a lot of new music, because we'd get promos, and they would just, something cool would play it, like when you're working, to make the day go by a little quicker. And then I remember hearing this, and I was just like, damn, this is like one of the most incredible things I think I've ever heard. And right out of the box with Blinded by Fear, it's like, it's almost like that track is like too good to be an opening track on the album. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And funny story about that song. It was the last song that they wrote for the album. And they wrote it specifically because they felt they needed an opener. They felt they didn't have one. And Anders, that the song was written very quickly. And he thinks it's the worst song on the record, or at least he did. Yeah, he did at the time I interviewed him, in whatever it was, 15 years ago. That's what he told me. Yeah, it was almost like an afterthought. It was like they're the equivalent of like, Paranoid for Black Sabbath, which was like, they just needed to fill up the space. And so they wrote this song in like 10 seconds, and it becomes the classic, track.
What other tracks do you dig on this record? Like, do you have any favorites?
I mean, man, the title track is like unstoppable, and Cold, of course, is really good. And I've got some fun facts about both of those songs. The famous, everybody knows, in the title track, the very beginning, Thomas Lindbergh shouts, "Go!"
Yeah.
That apparently they were so meticulous about the vocals, that took 40 takes to get that, just the go. The go, 40 takes to get it just right where Thomas and Frederick Nordstrom wanted it. 40 takes. And the lyrics for Cold, my other favorite, apparently Thomas Lindbergh wrote the lyrics after watching Menace to Society, the Hughes film. Yep.
Huh.
Yeah.
I don't see the connection though.
Well, the song is kind of about societal decay, I suppose.
Okay.
So I guess that's where it comes from. And there's another movie reference in the film, or a sample even, the sound of the gun cocking at the beginning of Suicide Nation.
Yeah.
That is that's from Reservoir Dogs.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
That's a favorite film of mine, actually.
Yeah, there you go. I mean, there's so many guns being cocked in Reservoir Dogs. It's hard to say which one, but they sampled one of them for Suicide Nation at the very beginning.
It's possible that there is only one sound of a gun being cocked being used throughout the entire film.
It's true,
because all that stuff is all done, and it's all like sound replaced,
right.
like sound design. It's
like Lars Ulrich's snare on Load.
Ugh, God. And once again, to go on a little bit of a tangent, it's sad to think that Metallica really only existed for me in those first few years, and I think in like 1989 is like when that band ceased to exist for me, and that's a long time ago, man.
Yeah, it is. But speaking of drum motherfuckery, can we say that? I don't know. Maybe you can edit that out.
Yeah, it's a good word.
This was from my article, the Hall of Fame article. This was kind of a new thing that wasn't being done that much in 1995. But Adrian Erlandson's kick drum, 20% of it, or roughly 20%, is the kick drum sound from Pantera's Far Beyond Driven. They mixed that in. And 20% of his snare is actually the snare from Rain and Blood.
Really?
So that's what he told me. Yeah, and that was like, and Slaughter the Soul is one of the first records that's not like a big commercial, like major label record to do that, apparently.
Yeah, it leads back to what I was saying earlier. Like, like this is probably, I think to date, 2019, probably the best sounding record, Earache has ever put out. And that's why it blew my mind even more so back then, because I was listening, used to listening to like, Napalm Death, and records sound good, but like this one sounded like some next level production, and I guess they were doing some trickery in the studio that like was ahead of the curve as far as like independent records go.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it's also it's something else that goes into it. Not just, I mean, the sound is, I mean, obviously there's the quality of the production, but also, I mean, I think there's something to be said for, I mean, the history of this record is, I mean, it is a revenge album.
Okay.
Like these guys at the Gates were on, before this record came out, before they even wrote it, when they were on this tour in England, they were signed to Peaceville Records at this time, the previous record. And they're on this tour in England, and the promoter took off with all the cash after just 2 shows. And they were kind of stranded. They were in England with like no food, like nothing for like 4 days. And Peaceville, the record label, either wouldn't bail. It's unclear. Either they wouldn't bail them out or didn't have the money to bail them out. But either way, At the Gates were pretty frustrated with that. So they were on tour with Seance at the time, which was Patrick Jensen's band, who of course went on to be in Witchery and then went on to be in The Haunted with the Bueller brothers from At the Gates. They were on tour with Seance. Seance were on Black Mark, which was Bathory's label. Patrick somehow convinced Black Mark to like fax over a contract that allowed Black Mark to like basically give At the Gates bailout cash so they could get home. But they didn't pay it back in 45 days. They'd have the rights to the next record. Oh. But then Earache came in, and Earache kind of put even more money, enough money. Earache apparently gave him enough money that they were able to pay off Black Mark, and still go into the studio for like 6 weeks or something to record this record. So and they were pissed. At the Gates were like, that's kind of how the article starts. That's kind of the prelude to all of this. They were pissed about that situation, and that kind of went into that was kind of the attitude they had going into this record. So I think that comes across too, certainly,
Yeah, definitely. And I mean that's in an era when people were spending money on making records too.
Yeah.
I mean, the record sounds like they spent money on it for sure.
Yeah.
But more importantly, though, it sounds like these guys rehearsed like 8 hours a day before they went in to record the album. You know what I mean?
So totally, absolutely. And that was the case. From what I can gather, that was absolutely the case. I mean, I think there was a line in the article where it's like, yeah, we didn't do pre-production. I mean, we just rehearsed a lot,
Yeah. I remember that being like very apparent to me when I first heard this record, and it actually motivated me to get into like a very disciplined rehearsal schedule with the band I was playing in at the time.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and I was thinking about like at the Gates, and I think I might have read an interview talking about one of the members talking about how they were doing double sessions of rehearsal and stuff, and it made me think about like wrestling practice and two-a-days and stuff like that. And I'm like, man, this is like a really good approach for music, and that kind of put me on my like drill sergeant sort of approach to band rehearsal, at least during the late 90s. And and I think that it comes across in the record just because of the precision. And I think this is like in the 90s, so it had to be before all of like Pro Tools, where you could punch in milliseconds. So I'm assuming they recorded this whole thing on tape, which isn't as forgiving as the electronic media.
Yeah, that's another thing they pointed out too. All these songs were played like all the way through.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and they were super stringent about that. And another thing to point out, talking about the production, how great it sounds and how well rehearsed they are. It just goes to show you that stuff is way more important than your equipment, because Anders was playing a $200 guitar through a speaker cabinet that he built with his dad. It was a homemade speaker cabinet. And it was, it sounded so good that the guy from Jesper from In Flames, asked to borrow it for their next record, for In Flames' next record. Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny how a lot of those bands in Sweden, like, even Entombed, like they were talking about how they played through combos, on those early Entombed records with just the HM2 pedal.
Yeah. Yeah. Which sounds insane to us now, but it's like, I'm pretty sure those not that the Burzum records were like sonic masterpieces, but I'm pretty sure that all that stuff was through a combo amp too.
Oh yeah. I one of the things that's memorable about, Until the Light Takes Us is Varg talking about making the first Burzum record, and he didn't want to spend any time getting sounds, and he instructed the engineer to come up with the worst sounding microphone possible, and that would be perfect for the record. And I guess they recorded a lot of that using just like headphones or something like that,
Yeah, like insane. Yeah.
But you know what, man? Like the use of the HM2 pedal, which is like that Swedish guitar sound.
Yeah.
I've never been able to like get that to sound the right way, recorded or live. It's never worked.
My experience with it is that it's like so distinct that it makes all those. It instantly when you hear it. And it's even like I don't even have one anymore. But when I did have one, I would turn it on and be like, oh, that sounds just like that record, which is great. But it's also like, well, do I want to just sound like all that other stuff? You know what I mean? It's like, so like, I can pick it out like on, I can pick it out when on a record, when there's a big HM2 revival seems to be happening lately. And it's like, just so obvious. It's so distinct. It just seems like you're signing up for this like pre-made, it's like it sounds prefab at this point. It doesn't have the magic that it had on, Left Hand Path or something like that,
Yeah, definitely. And this is like the second revival, I think, of the HM2 pedal.
Yeah.
There was one I remember like maybe 10 years ago. I felt like there's tons of bands putting out records and touring, and I'd look down and I'd see these dudes all playing through HM2 pedals. And I like bought several of them because I wanted to find, I figured I'd be able to find one that sounded cool that I would like, but I never was able to make it work for me really.
Yeah.
And I just remember we toured with a band one time in Europe, and the guitar player he was the HM2 guy, and it was like, it was all cool like when you're doing single notes, but then whenever you went to chords, it was just like you couldn't even discern like what chord was being played, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But actually, I don't know if these guys actually used HM2 on these records. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. See, that's a good one. See, I think whatever they did, I remember reading, okay, so they if I'm remembering the article right, they used they tried many different amps and many different pedals. They didn't name any specifically. I wouldn't be surprised if the HM2 is in there, but it's being done like, it's definitely not on both guitars. And, you know what I mean? Like, so they're offsetting it somehow. So you don't hear this and go, oh, HM2, like it's being blended in tastefully, I might add, with whatever the other guy is doing, if it's even there,
Yeah, I would think that it's probably layered in there somewhere, just because they're Swedish,
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, that's that 11-year hiatus that they took. Lindbergh went on to do a bunch of different bands too during that period.
Oh yeah, like a million bands.
Yeah.
A million bands.
The Great Deceiver.
Yep. The Great Deceiver. What else was he in, man? I used to be able to rap. So let's see. The Great Deceiver. Oh, he was in Lock Up for a minute. The Crown for a minute. His hardcore band was Skit System, which was kind of, sort of. Oh, Dysphere, dude.
Yeah, Relapse put out a bunch of their records.
Yeah.
I think Dysphere is still. That's one of those bands that I wouldn't be surprised if like next year they had an album come out. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It just
No,
seems
absolutely.
like this project thing that, is always sort of in production at some point.
So I mean, yeah, it was 11 years before before they got back together, but it was actually almost 20 before they put out another record. Their At War with Reality didn't come out till 2014.
Wow. Yeah, because it
Yeah.
started out as just like reunions, I think, right?
Yeah.
Like they were just gonna
Yeah.
go and play like Slaughter of the Soul like live, and then
Oh, I remember doing like interviews for years with them where they're like, no, and the same thing with Carcass. Nope, we're not putting out a new record. We don't want to tarnish the legacy. No, 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 we're not going to do it. And then they did it.
But I gotta say, as much as I do like their last couple records, but
Yeah, in fact, I would even go as far as to say that I like the newest one, To Drink from the Night Itself. I thought A War of Reality was really good when it came out. It was cool. It wasn't as good as Slaughter of the Soul. Neither is the new one. But I think To Drink from the Night Itself, which came out last year, is actually better than At War with Reality. And it's interesting because what I like about it is that I think it's kind of like a throwback to Slaughter of the Soul in a lot of ways. And Anders is not on that record. So it kind of makes you scratch your head a little bit, but it's cool,
I wasn't aware that Anders wasn't on that record until you just said that.
Yeah. Yeah.
I saw them last summer at Hellfest, and it was incredible. And I have to say that, like, I jumped up and down like extra hard when they played the songs from Slaughter of the Soul.
Yeah, of course.
They
Yeah,
still are just so impactful and powerful songs.
What's your favorite?
My favorite, okay, Suicide Nation. And I have to say, I get excited when I hear that gun, that slide into the chamber, man. I'm like, yeah, some action's going to happen. And I got to say, Blinded by Fear. I know it's like the throwaway song according to the band, but it's like that song is like, it just, it gets me going. I love that song.
Yeah, I mean, we should specify that it's probably only a throwaway to them. I don't think anyone else views it that way. I mean, it's probably it's got to be for an At the Gates fan, it's got to be a favorite,
And of course the title track, Slaughter of the Soul, is amazing. It's
Yeah.
like, being like, trying to be a cool guy and like, well, I want to pick like an album track, you know what I mean? But I got to give respect where respect is due. And Slaughter of the Soul, the title track on the album, is, in my opinion, probably my favorite song the band has ever done.
Yeah, oh, me too. Yeah, oh, there's no question about it. Yeah, it's fantastic. It's iconic.
It is. Yeah,
it's reached that level.
Just going through my notes here real quick. See if I got
Okay.
anything else. So there's been they've garnered a bunch of accolades too. I know the record, I don't believe it charted anywhere, but
Okay.
in 2005, the album was ranked number 300 in Rock Hard Magazine's book of the 500 greatest rock and metal albums of all time.
It seems low.
I think so too, man. I would put that at. I want to know what's above that.
Yeah, I mean, obviously if it's rock and metal, you're opening it up pretty far.
Yeah, you might have like Sabbath in there, and you'll have like some Zeppelin.
Yeah,
but
right,
even with that sort of company, I would still put it in the top 50.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Metal Injection ranked Slaughter of the Soul number 8 on their list of top 10 influential heavy metal albums.
Okay. Yeah.
And of course, Slaughter of the Soul was inducted into the Decibel magazine Hall of Fame that Jay Bennett, wrote the piece for.
True story.
Yeah.
True story. Yeah.
So, it's been recognized. And like I said, unlike the other, most of the other classic records that we've, sort of cited here on Metal Matters, I think this one unanimously among the listeners, most people will agree that it's a classic record. Some people won't agree on some of the choices we made, but I think this one will definitely, the consensus will be that this is something of a classic record.
As well it should be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Jay, what's new and exciting in your world, be it writing or music, anything happening?
Let's see. I don't know. It's funny. It's felt like a little bit like old home week a little bit lately here, because I've been talking to you a lot about these classic records. I just did an interview with our old friend Trevor from Pelican, because they have a new record coming out.
Right.
I just did a story that's coming out soon for Decibel on Cave In, our old friends Cave In.
Oh, great.
Because they have a record coming out, and then I just wrote a new bio for Torch, because they have a new record coming out. So it's like all the old, all kind of like the old crew, are all kind of hanging around lately. It's funny. It's kind of a throwback to, I don't know, 15 years ago or longer, even 20. Kind of cool.
I think we're playing with Torch in June at this festival out in Colorado. They're on the bill, but I don't know what the lineups are. It's like a 2-day kind of thing. And somewhere in that mix is Torch, Thou, we're playing, Jeff Wilson's new band, Chrome. Well, it's not a new band, but it's new-ish in the fact that it's something that he's going to be touring with. Chrome Waves is also playing. We're doing some dates together to get out there and back. And yeah, but I don't know if Torch is playing the same day we're playing, but it'd be cool if they were, because I haven't seen him in years.
Well, John, who was their bass player, he switched to guitar now.
I didn't know that. Yeah,
he switched to guitar, and they've got their bass player is I want to say his name is Alex. He's the main dude from Wrong, that kind of noise and rock band from Miami.
Oh, okay, yeah, all right.
Yeah. He's the bass player now, and John switched to guitar. And that's how it is on their new record, apparently, too. That's what they did. So, a little bit of a shift there. Yeah. But their new record is cool. It sounds good.
Yeah, I should check it out.
Yeah, I think it comes out in like July, but they might already have released a song or two. I don't know how that stuff works, but yeah, it's pretty cool, man. Yeah.
Well, once again, Jay, thanks for breaking off some time to talk about these things.
My pleasure, man. Anytime, Mike. I like this. This is fun. I like doing this. It's cool.
Yeah, and thanks everyone for listening. That's it for this week's episode of Metal Matters, the Gimme Radio weekly podcast. Tune in next week and see what we have in store for you. The show is available on all streaming platforms, Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Spotify, etc. Also, be sure to check out Gimme Radio, streaming on the web, iOS, or Android, for one of the best metal communities, exclusive merch, interviews with artists, and so much more. I'll catch you guys next week. Take care.